Hello and welcome. I am Lian Buan and this is Rappler Talk. When the first Bayanihan law was passed last year, there were a lot of alarms raised on its provisions. Takeover of private facilities and punishing fake news, for example. But procurement experts zeroed in on one clause. Bayanihan exempted pandemic procurements from Republic Act 9184 or the procurement law. The practical effect was that the contracts no longer underwent public bidding and instead emergency and negotiated procurements. The result? A lot of adverse audit findings and potentially corruption, particularly in the award of the biggest contracts to a small firm whose major stockholder is Singaporean, wanted in Taiwan for several financial crimes. To unpack all of that, we have on the show today Michael Miko Cañares. He's a certified public accountant and advocate of open data whose most recent research is on COVID-19 and procurement both in the Philippines and in Guatemala. Magandang araw, Miko. Salamat sa panahon na binigay mo sa Rappler today.
Magandang hapon, Yan, and also good afternoon to everyone who's watching currently, or particularly the people from Bohol where I currently live. So magandang hapon sa lahat.
Ay, magandang araw sa mga taga Bohol. Unang tanong, what was the findings of your recent research? Very interesting, COVID-19 procurements.
So the research was actually conducted in Guatemala and in the Philippines, and we're looking at whether or not procurement was actually inclusive. By saying inclusive, we're looking into whether yung procurement ba ng dalawang country na ito ay actually, how do you call it? It actually responds to the different needs of people. Kasi alam natin, every person, every sector has differentiated needs. And what we actually saw was that, for example, even in the Philippines, in the distribution of goods to households, for example, there was actually no recognition of, for example, whether or not there are females in the household who might be using sanitary pads, for example. So in this case, for example, we see that governments are actually doing procurement as if there are no differentiated needs across the population. So parang there's the inclusion dimension there that's actually lacking.
That's really very interesting. I'll talk to you more about that even off-cam because it's a very interesting topic. Babalik ko dun sa agenda natin today, which is, was there potentially corruption in the pandemic? Naalala ko last year when the first Bayanihan law was passed, syempre yung pinaka parang main usapan is yung tanggalin yung clause on takeover of private facilities, yung punishing fake news. But I was talking to officials who are usually involved in the procurement process. Sabi niya, hindi mag-focus ka dun sa exemption sa 9184 because that will create an environment conducive daw to corruption. Ikaw, when you were informed of that na may ganong exemption sa Bayanihan, what went through your mind and did you foresee that something like this, what's happening now, did you foresee something like this?
So siguro I'd like to segment my answer to the question in several ways. So I think, for example, I'd like to ask the question, is negotiated procurement a normal recourse during emergencies of this scale? I would answer to say, my answer would be yes. Of course, across the world, procurement rules are relaxed in many countries to enable governments to purchase the needed equipment and supplies to respond effectively and efficiently during the pandemic. For example, in a research conducted in 2020 with the Open Contracting Partnership covering 12 countries, and I'd like to mention what these countries are: Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, Georgia, Guatemala, Kenya, Lithuania, Nepal, Nigeria, Paraguay, Uruguay, and the Philippines. It was found out that all these countries resorted to emergency procurement procedures. And in the case of the Philippines, we call it negotiated procurement, to make government response swift, immediate, and efficient. So, but however, are there risks related to this? The answer is, of course, yes. When you relax procurement rules, you also relax stringent controls.
Yeah.
So yung controls kasi, they are there to ensure government assets are safeguarded, or that in the case of procurement, government money is actually, we are actually getting good value for its money. And also at the same time, corrupt procurement practices are avoided. So sa Pilipinas ba, for example, ano nangyari? We moved from public bidding to negotiated procurement. And that eliminates actually certain publication requirements. And with, for example, procuring entities, agencies of government, negotiating directly with a supplier. So shielding much of the processes from scrutiny. Tapos, Lian, I'd like to mention yung isang finding doon sa study na yun, which actually captures how the Philippines is actually doing. And I'd like to quote the study. Sabi niya dito, risk factors in emergency procurement include higher and more uncertain prices for key emergency items, an increase in multipurpose suppliers or companies with no previous experience in the public procurement market or in selling emergency supplies.
That
Does
is
this happen?
exactly what is happening. That is exactly what is happening.
Yeah, yung sinabi mo kanina that COA has mentioned that, for example, in most its recent report, na yung negotiated procurement actually has led to these irregularities.
Yeah.
And just one more thing, Lian. And we should note that it doesn't actually happen with national agencies. So, for example, if news outlets will look into the different audit reports of different provinces, local government units, you just can imagine. In the province already, for example, in the 2020 audit report of COA, it has mentioned that the provincial government of Bohol committed a fund loss of 5.8 million pesos because it purchased goods beyond the ceiling set by the Department of Health in its price freeze department memoranda issued all throughout the year. So, yeah.
Actually, lagi ngang sinasabi yan na if you look at the audit reports of LGUs and yung mga smaller entities like boards, water boards, mas maraming audit finding. I guess they didn't expect it to happen to the DOH and PSDBM, or the two main agencies tasked to conduct PPE procurement during the pandemic. I guess sinabi mo nga na parang really in the pandemic to expedite purchases, I think everyone is in the agreement and understanding na kailangan talagang medyo mabilisan, i-relax mo ng konti. What do you think was the fundamental flaw in this system, or by the way our procurement systems is designed, kung bakit nauwi tayo sa bumili ang PSDBM ng napakaraming mahal na PPE tas hindi na lang ngayon maibenta sa mga agencies nila and they're idle sa mga depot? What do you think?
I think there are several issues that you mentioned here, and I think each deserve actually some level of teasing out. Okay, pag-usapan natin yung expensive supplies sitting in depot sa DBM. So we know that one of the functions of DBMPS is to purchase, warehouse, and distribute items for resale to agencies of government, including GOCCs. So the idea here is that DBM should be able to procure common use supplies at a better price because they actually purchase in bulk. Maramihan sila kung mag-purchase. However, if you are to follow what happened, DBMPS actually purchased medical supplies and equipment with a high markup price. Therefore, when they sell this to government agencies, it has to be based on how much these supplies were procured. Now, kung LGU ka, Lian, tapos bibigyan ka ni DBM ng ganitong presyo, kung you can procure it at a lower price because they were not able to foresee that at the initial rise of the price, it will taper down and will increase. Wala na. So it's sitting there primarily because agencies or LGUs would say, we'll not buy from you because you're so expensive. We can source it out from somewhere else. So a second issue, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yung second issue na gusto kong sabihin would be the issue of expediency and prudence, as well as getting good value for government's money. No? Of course, we know that the pandemic requires emergency response and purchase of essential supplies have to be done soon and fast. But is procuring fast in conflict with being prudent? I should say no. So let's locate these values within the context of the household. If you are told to buy rice because we no longer have rice to saing for dinner, and we really need to do it fast. So just outside our house, for example, there's a grocer who sells it at a 54 a kilo. You call the nearby store a few minutes walk right away, who sells it at 40. Will you buy at the grocer outside your house because you want to have it fast? It's still 4:10 or 4:20 in the afternoon now, so walking wouldn't hurt. And walking to buy will not jeopardize our goal of having rice ready for dinner at around 6. So what's wrong for me here is how people treat the notion of negotiated procurement. For some people, it gives them the idea that they can do what they want with the money given relaxed procurement scrutiny, thinking too that they can reason out with expediency later. They did not anticipate that reasonableness and prudence still persists. So, yun. And finally, all these overpriced supplies, para sa akin diyan, point to the fact that maybe, just maybe, those undertaking procurement in agencies and local governments, at best, we're not able to read the signs of the market, right? Or at worst, we're too lazy to determine what is the best procurement option for the government, given its context of limited resources. You really still need to think, well, if indeed, for example, if you're a public official, you're a custodian of government resources. Dapat nag-isip ka sana.
Very, very excellent points, Miko. Kasi yung sinasabi mo nga, yung example of a household na kailangan na ng bigas, put that in a large scale. Yun kasi yung sinasabi kanina ni Secretary Galvez actually sa Senado. Kasi daw, nung April nung nag-lockdown, yes, meron silang mga kausap na local suppliers, pero in need, desperate, kailangan na namin. So nagpadala sila ng mga barko, ng mga eroplano to China and got all of these supplies na ngayon nga ay hindi nila ma-i-resell sa mga agency. And what the auditor said in the audit report of PSDBM, kulang sila ng marketing design and mga policy and inventory policy. Is it an excuse na sabihin, nobody knows how to manage a pandemic? We saw our kababayan needing face mask. We did what we can to buy face mask at all expense. I mean, is that a justifiable reason?
I would definitely disagree with that point. Kasi kahit on the level of emergency situations, you still have your remaining faculties to actually tell you or to help you decide which one is the biggest, which one is the better option on the part of the government. Like for example, kung pag-usapan natin yung need. Again, we go back to my point a while ago that if you put that in a context, you can still balance expediency with prudence in the kind of decisions that you make.
Do you think the Philippines has enough? Kasi nanggaling naman na tayo sa, for example, Yolanda or Marawi or even wars. Do you think the Philippines has enough experience to actually manage an emergency para makapaggawa ng mga maayos na mga procurement policies and procurement design?
I think I should say that sa situation natin, I mean, of course, we could acknowledge the fact that this pandemic is something like no other. We haven't had any experience on this. But I think the types of disasters that we have had in the past that are also of enormous scale could be good sources on which we'll be able to make the right and appropriate decisions.
Right. Okay, I'm gonna pivot the discussion to the hot topic, yung Formally, which we found out incorporated only in 2019 with 625,000 paid up capital, no track record whatsoever. Unang-una, kapag negotiated procurement ba, hindi mo na i-check yung kumpanyang kumukuha ng kontrata sa'yo?
Ay hindi. Definitely no. Kasi pag titingnan mo yung rules, the procuring agency is still required to determine whether, for example, in this case, Formally, as a supplier, is legally, technically, and financially capable so satisfy the procurement. So para sa akin, if you engage with the bidder, if you're a procuring entity, you ask at least three main questions. Is the supplier legally capable? Second, is the supplier technically capable? And third, is the supplier financially capable? Now, GPPB was very clear about this in its resolution, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 03-2020, and also the non-policy matter opinion of 03-2020, when they said there is a requirement for legal capability. Like, for example, my business permit, my income tax returns and requirement, pero a little bit silent on the others. Pero ang view ko dito, no, that there is guidance elsewhere in RA 9184, and its implementing rules and regulations is pregnant with guidance that will help you decide better. No? Okay, so kasi sinabi mo si Formally, interested ako dyan. Kasi if you look at the case of financial capability, Lian, according to RA 9184, we can evaluate financial capability using, for example, the net financial contracting capacity. Diba? Or simply put, the ability of a company to deliver a financially on a contract, right? Para sa mga accountants na nandito, may formula yan. Yung parang current assets minus current liabilities minus the value of outstanding or completed project, and so on and so forth. Pero let's explain that in layperson's terms. So net financial contracting capacity para sa akin simply means the ability of a supplier to deliver on a proposed contract, taking into account his current assets and his current liabilities. Ngayon, may isa lang akong ipa-plug dito na magandang studio na ginawa. There's work done by fellow accountants Brurao and John Michael Laba. Kasama ang Citizens Budget Tracker and the Right to Know Right Now Coalition. I don't know
I
if you've
think I saw a preview pero hindi ko pa nabasa. So please tell the audience the gist of that study.
Okay, just going briefly into the
Yes.
financial capacity part. Sabi na doon sa report, currently and today, and I really advise all of you here listening to get a copy. What the accountants did was actually evaluate if indeed Pharmaceutical Corporation has the financial capability to deliver on the contract. So they used the financial statements that the corporation submitted to regulatory agencies. So anong nakita nila doon? And gusto ko i-quote yung findings nila kasi masyadong politically correct yung language. So i-quote lang natin. So sabi na doon, a review of the company's financial statements does not inspire confidence that the company has the financial capacity to fulfill 7.9 billion worth of contracts awarded in a short period of time. So, ano ibig sabihin doon? Pag tayong magbabasa doon diyan, ano kayang malalagay sa utak natin?
I-unpack ko yung NFCC. May isa pa sa IRR ng 908 for yung SLCC, yung single largest completed contract. Now, people are saying, and actually this is my question too, kasi pag binasa mo yung IRR, parang sa public bidding lang siya required. Hindi nga nag-public bidding and it is allowed that they waive public bidding. So when you go into a negotiated procurement, is NFCC and SLCC strictly required, or kung hindi man required, gaya nga ng sinasabi mo kanina, ano yung others na titignan para ma-sure mo na makakapag-deliver on the contract yung supplier na kinuha mo?
So if you look at the guidelines, there's really no specific requirement on previous matching contracts or for an FCC, which is stated as a requirement only for infrastructure, no? Pero para sa akin, if you're the end user who's buying a supplies, and you're negotiating procurement, you could also ask for additional requirements. So like for example, yung sinasabi mo, single largest completed contracts for goods and services. But having said that, Lian, it is all about common sense, ano? That if you buy from somebody, you have to ascertain that your supplier is legal, that they can deliver what you need, and they have the resources to deliver your required number. So that, again, it's situated in the context of the household. So I just had my house repainted, by the way, to contribute to employment. If I will use it as an example, I need paint of different colors and hues, dapat weatherproof, and so on and so forth. Now, should I get that from a supplier wherein, kasi kung kulang yung assets mo to actually, if I need, for example, 500,000 worth of paint, and then ang nakalagay lang sa financial statement mo is 100,000 worth of paint, di ba? Will I buy from you? Sa tingin ko hindi, no? So in this case, for example, by awarding the contract to Pharmaly, kung titanong natin, was the procuring entity negligent? Not for me to say, but the responsibility now is for DBMPS to show proof why it awarded 8 billion of contracts to an entity whose net financial contracting capacity was only 5.9 million as of 20.
Yeah. Actually, 10 billion so far kasi may additional 2 billion in 2021.
Yeah, so kung titignan mo yan, Lian, that's just common sense, right? But we all know not everyone uses common sense these days, intentionally or unintentionally.
Yes. Bago ako mag-move sa next topic, Miko, i-address ko lang kasi the justification so far of Malacanang at least was that it was Pharmaly daw kasi who had the capacity to deliver that much in that time frame na binigay ng gobyerno because nga we badly needed. Pero kanina sa Senate, please watch if it's still ongoing. They had as guest speakers mga local manufacturers and one of them, EMS, was saying, we can. Kaya namin. In fact, we committed to delivering what the country needed. As in, inabandon na nila yung core business nila and they repurposed their factories to manufacture mga face masks. And they were saying they can. And I guess that's the Senate, and that's for the Senate and the investigators to conclude on. Moving on to another topic, yung COA report ng ng DOH, bukod dun sa fund transfer to the PSDBM, meron din silang mga flag na undocumented cash allowances. Ito yung mga parang gift certificate daw kasi yung mga binigay ng mga ospital sa kanilang mga health worker, and other undocumented cash allowances. Is it bothersome ang ganitong issue sa pandemic? Kasi if I'm listening to it and I'm reading it, iisipin ko, Diyos ko, nasa pandemic ka na, maghanap ka pa ng resibo. Paano kung kailangan ko na ng something? And, di ba, parang expedited. Is it bothersome in the pandemic to have so much unliquidated cash allowances and cash advances?
Siguro, masyadong bias yung response ko dito. Kasi as an accountant, the answer to this question is obvious for me. Pandemic or not, undocumented expenses, be that an allowance or a payment for somebody's services, is never acceptable. As a government agency, you are entrusted with people's money. No rationalization for expediency will justify any spending of money without sufficient proof. That's for me.
Yeah, kasi 'di ba the longest and perpetual debate pagdating sa COA ay pinapahirapan kasi ng mga accountant at auditor yung buhay naming mga kawani ng gobyerno. Bibili na nga lang kami ng ballpen, matatakot pa kaming makowa. Is that I'm sure you've heard of this a lot, but is that a justifiable reason to maybe say baka naman OA ang COA, nasa COVID naman tayo?
But for me, that is an exaggeration to a certain extent, right? But then it's true. If you are actually having controls installed, it will actually delay processes. That's why, for example, GPPB relaxed procurement rules. Kasi nga, we don't actually need to go through all those hassles of actually documenting a bidding procedure and so on and so forth. Pero sa akin pa rin, you really have to be mindful because that's people's money. That's not your money. Kahit ako, I married an accountant, Lian. So, nung first week namin, binigyan ako ng asawa ko ng pera. After 1 week, binigay ko sa kanya complete with receipts. So, that I do that for my own household. That's money of the people eh. So, hindi pwedeng sasabihin mo na we don't have any, you just have to, for me, that's a lame excuse. It lacks planning. Because if you really need to distribute something, then print the advance, print the documentation that's needed for that prior to the distribution. That's just plain simple. And that's required of you. Because you're actually spending public resources.
Tsaka par for the course naman sa government agencies ang mag-liquidate always. Buhay na nila yon, di ba? Hindi naman nangyari lang ito sa COVID.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And if it has been a habit of the past, then why would it be any difficult? Yeah. Pero alam mo, makikita mo yan na hindi yan ginagawa ng iba. I can see, for example, pag titingnan mo, kung yung may mga time dyan, tingnan nyo yung mga audit reports ng mga munisipyo nyo. Makikita nyo, may mga unliquidated advances ng 2010 pa. Hanggang ngayon, unliquidated pa rin. So, baka habit forming na.
Yeah, tip to those who care about good governance. COA is such a rich resource. Kunin niyo yung mga past audit reports ng mga LGU nyo at makikita there's a document there called Status of Past Year's Recommendation. At makikita nyo doon kung ano na minsan mga 2014 pa hindi pa nila naliliquidate yung kanilang, and it's not just happening in LGUs. Merong mga national agencies na notorious pa rin sa ganyan. Let's go to transparency and open data, your advocacy. Isa rin sa mga flinag sa, for example, sa PSDBM, and actually I noticed this in DPWH, hindi sila nag-comply dun sa requirement to post notices and invitations to bid sa PhilJeps. Pag negotiated procurement ba, kailangan mo pa rin mag-post sa PhilJeps?
Sa rules ng emergency procurement for COVID-19, tama ka doon na they're not actually required RFPs to be posted kasi hindi ka naman on PhilJeps, no? Kasi you can directly negotiate with the supplier. Pero nakalagay din doon that the BAC through its secretariat shall post for information purposes yung NOA, yung contract, yung purchase order, sa website ba yan ng agency or in a conspicuous place ng premises ng agency or sa portal ng GPPB for emergency procurement under the Bayanihan Act. So ibig sabihin doon, there's still a publication requirement. And that publication requirement is important because for some people like us who would like to also monitor what our governments are, what our local governments are actually procuring, makikita namin doon kung ano yung pinoprocure nila, who are actually being given these contracts.
Which in fairness to the GPPB at least, rich yung GPPB portal. If you go there, you can see a tab dun sa Bayanihan Procurement. And some agencies, for example, PITC, masipag din silang mag-upload ng mga NOAA nila. So I'll ask you, either in this era, pandemic era, or yung mga recent years, how would you rate the Philippine government's open data policy? Kasi kung ako, na ordinaryong tao, feeling ko ang ganda kasi ang dami ko nakukuha, COA, GPPB, yung mga transparency seal. Pero ikaw, ano yung rating mo sa open data natin?
Some 4 years ago, Lian, I spoke in an international conference in Buenos Aires, wherein I said that the open data initiative in the Philippine government is actually dead. Oh. And that assessment is not without basis. Because when we talk about open data, it's not just publication of data sets. It's also about how data sets are being published and made available. For example, sabi mo tama, it's true that agencies publish data on their websites. Yes. Again, do they publish all their data sets? No. Do they publish this in open formats? No. The PDF, for example, is not open data because if you put up a financial statement there and that's actually put up in PDF, we cannot act, especially kung pinicturean mo pa tapos ginawa mo PDF. Ang hirap niya niyang i-analyze at mag-scrape. But then also, are they clear about whether this data is reusable? The answer also is no. Are the data available for bulk download? The answer is no. So sa ngayon, kung pupunta ka sa data.gov.ph, the open data portal is just a mere collection of things that the government wants to publish. Also, there are so many data sets in data.gov.ph that were once available during the time of the late former President Aquino, and they are no longer there. And by the way, just to make mention here, in the last 4 months, we did a research on environmental data disclosed in 4 cities across Southeast Asia. That's Manila, Philippines. That's Thailand, in Bangkok in Thailand. That's Hanoi in Vietnam, and that's Jakarta in Indonesia. Alam mo, kulila tayo diyan sa open data on the environment, open data for environment. Wala kang makitang, for example, air quality data in our data sets that are actually open. Samantalang sa Bangkok, tsaka sa Jakarta, they publish that on a regular basis. So people will actually know how is the air quality of their part. So again, I think ang daming mga open data advocates in this country who would really say that, my God, this government actually has failed tremendously on making open data a norm in public data publication in government. So kasi dati pinapasa-pasa na yan eh. So dati during Pinoy's time, it was actually within the Department of Budget and Management. May GAA pa nga, may General Appropriations Act pa nga dati na nagsasabing everything that is funded by this current budget should be published in open data in your website or in data.gov.ph. Ngayon wala na. I mean, like I don't know if the ICT is taking a lead on that, on who was doing that anymore. I mean, like pag titingnan mo ngayon, hindi mo makikita lahat ng data sets. In other countries, we can see, for example, one cohesive portal, all data are there from different government agencies. Tingnan mo yung data.gov.ph ngayon and you will see the drought of good quality data sets.
Can you provide to us an example siguro ng best practices kung ano yung available sa mga ibang bansa na hindi natin nakikita dito and which we may not be aware of? Kala namin ang ganda na ng data na nakukuha namin pero may mga iba pa pala kami hindi nakukuha.
Like for example, data on budgets. Meron tayo, but we don't have data on spending. So, iba yun eh kasi budget is different from spending. So, there are a lot of other countries that are good at this. Of course, these are much more advanced. Like, for example, the UK is good at this, Canada is good at this. And also, there are small packets of cities that are actually publishing data on a regular basis. So, kasi para sa akin, lahat sana ng pinagagastusan ng public funds should actually be put out there publicly. So, all agencies, for example, and also all data assets of agencies Alam mo, I don't, alam mo, I just remembered na 3 years ago, we did this study on whether or not the agencies actually have a list of a data inventory. Ang daming wala. They don't actually have data assets. So if they don't have data assets, a list of data assets, how do we ensure that they're all actually publishing everything? So, yun. Yung mga questions na ganito, ma-lift out na ito out to the open, special kung may mga researchers na ang hihingi ng data. Ngayon, Lian, just to backtrack a little bit, para sa akin, yung current administration kasi mas nandun sila doon sa reactive disclosure, which is different from proactive disclosure. Reactive disclosure meaning to say, for example, manghihingi ka, that's through the FOI process. Pero yung proactive disclosure, give it out there. Kung wala kang tinatago, ibigay na mo na rin lahat. No? Save, of course, for items that you would like to become exemptions, like trade secrets or personally identifiable information. Pero yung mga budgets, contracts, yung mga ganyan, put that out publicly.
And it's not like foi.gov.ph is so great either. Sobrang dami ko nang denied na request, or either they deny it or they prolong it. Kasi 'di ba 15 days dapat, pero sometimes happens to me a lot of times on the 15th day they'll say, can you give us more time? So nag-comply sila sa nasasagot sa on the 15th day, pero it's not actually. And then there's this suggestion, or I don't know if it's a threat from the president who said, wag na kayong sa COA, don't publish the annual audit reports. I mean, could you imagine the effect if COA stops publishing the annual audit reports?
Yeah, precisely. Those things that we're talking about today will not be put out into the open, right? We will not know this if you let actually go through the normal route of actually requesting the information. And the transaction costs are very high there, no? You really have to have a person to actually respond to people, and para sa akin, if you don't put that out publicly, so we really have to support COA and then also express our oneness with the auditors in COA to really demand that they continue publishing these documents, because these are actually part and parcel of actually being transparent and accountable, and then makes democracy and check and balance in government possible.
Right. And once again, it's still, the COA which instigated all these investigations. A lot of the things being discussed now in the Senate were not part of the audit reports. Pero dun tayo lahat nagsimula sa audit reports. We wouldn't have started looking at formally had it not been for that flag of COA na mahal yung kanilang mga face mask. Miko, I'll just read a comment from the stream. It's from Lani Milalio. Sabi niya, hindi dahilan ng pandemic para hindi nila gawin ang trabaho nila kasi hindi nila pera ang ginagastos nila. Which is what you said kanina.
Precisely. Exactly my point. Even if ourselves, for example, we account what we spend, dapat you also account those things that you spend na hindi mo sariling pera.
And another comment from Cesar Evangelista, if the COA stops publishing its annual reports, it would be a dereliction of their duty. I agree. But then, they can, pag sinasabi nila, I don't know if it's actually says something that they should publish that online, di ba? Kasi, sinabi ba doon?
Sinabi sa GAA. Nakalagay sa GAA. Sa GAA lang. So, pwedeng tanggalin. Pwedeng tanggalin ng Congress this year kung talagang gusto ni Pangulo. But then again, wag natin bigyan ng idea. Okay, Miko, down to my last two questions. With what you're seeing in the news, with what you've read in the audit reports, do you see a signal that there was corruption or there was massive corruption that may have happened in the pandemic?
That's a difficult question and a pretty loaded one, no? So let's unpack it a little bit. So first, what you see in the news, more particularly audit findings flagged by COA, does not necessarily point to corruption. For example, if you talk about DOH findings where 60 billion pesos were noted to have deficiencies, these do not necessarily send signals that there was massive corruption. Kasi if you go through the details, some of these are about unobligated amounts, or ibig sabihin yung mga amounts na dapat na-spend pero hindi nila na-spend. not meeting committed targets, procedural deficiencies in procurement, like for example, lack of documents, may unutilized supplies, pero may mga mismanagement of cash advances din and petty cash funds. So they do not necessarily point to corrupt practices, but may also be an indication of such. No? An investigation like a fraud audit will actually reveal this, whether or not these are actually corrupt practices. So second is, what exactly do we mean by massive? No? In audit kasi, Lian, there's a concept we call materiality. Naririnig ko yun sinasabi ni former COA Commissioner Heidi Mendoza dati when you spoke to her in one of the Rappler Talk. Diba? So, how do we save then if there's massive corruption? So, pag titingnan natin yung DOH has 104 billion of current operating expenditures during that audit period. And 60 billion of what that was noted by COA as containing deficiencies. Okay, let's just assume for the sake of argument that all of this are actually corrupt practices, are results of corrupt practices. The question is 67 billion material enough? Pero para sa akin, Dian, material or not, it's actually hindi na kailangan natin sasabihin na massive yung corruption na posibleng nangyayari for us to, for example, for the government to initiate an investigation.
Right.
I mean, like for example, yung what's sinasabi ng Pangulo natin na, ignore them, ignore the COA auditors. I mean, like if you're actually somebody who's galit with corruption, as what people have noted, you really would encourage COA to publish more or for the ombudsman to actually initiate cases.
Right. Excellent point kasi for us or anybody to say there was no corruption, there has to have been an investigation for you to do that conclusion. And in fairness to COA, I think Chairman Mike Aguinaldo has committed to the House of Representatives that they will look at formally. They would also look at vaccine procurement kahit daw may mga NDA, sisilipin nila yan. There's no indication yet kung magpa-fraud audit. You think it merits a fraud audit? The whole pandemic spending.
Sa kondisyon natin ngayon, feeling ko kailangan eh. Kasi I mean like at one end you actually see that that there are indications that there are indications somehow that there's something a little bit fishy out there. So and then I think it's a moral obligation to ensure na our government resources are actually used to save people's lives. Kasi hindi lang pera ang pinag-usapan natin dito. We're talking about people's lives that are lost. No? Ang daming namatay na mga healthcare providers, for example, that are actually doing their best under limited resources. And if there are, for example, resources that are not unspent, and these were not spent actually for the right reasons, I think there is the moral imperative to actually conduct further investigation. And a fraud audit would actually be helpful in that respect.
All right. With that, we end this. Sabi natin 30 minutes lang pero napasarap ang usapan. Naging 38 minutes. Thank you so much. That was our guest, Michael Cañares. Thank you for watching Rappler Talk.